Turn to John chapter 9, and we're continuing to explore the miracles of Jesus. And John said if you took all the books in all the libraries of the world, you couldn't contain the writings of all that Jesus did, all the miracles that he did. But we are going through and selecting different miracles from the Gospels and just studying the miracles of Jesus. John chapter 9 is a tremendous miracle that we're going to look at together today. When I was only a couple weeks old in the Lord, I'd only been a Christian for a very short time. And I don't remember the exact time frame, but it wasn't very long at all, just a matter of weeks. I was raised in a denominational church, and this denominational church that I was raised in did not have what we would call Bible preaching. Oh, there would be a message every week. It was about 15 minutes or 20 minutes. We called it a homily, and it had to do with modern events or be kind to one another. And there might have been a Bible verse in there, but in terms of Bible exposition, of opening the Word of God and just bringing forth the Word of God, well, I hadn't been exposed to that. I didn't know what that was. And to preach a sermon, I really didn't know anything about that. And the denomination was going to have what they called Youth Sunday. So the pastor of the church got the idea, he had heard that I'd had some experience with Christ, and I told him I wanted to learn how to preach. And so he called one day, actually came to visit first, but I wasn't there. And then he called back and said, Mark, would you preach a sermon in a couple weeks? Now, I'd only been a Christian I was 16 years old. I'd only been a Christian for a very short time, maybe even a matter of weeks. And immediately, I didn't even think about it. I didn't even pray about it. I thought, when is an opportunity like this going to come along again? I knew I needed to tell people about Jesus. Oh, sure, I'll do that. And, oh, you sure? Oh, absolutely. And we hung up the phone. And then I remember that moment. What in the world am I going to do? I've never had a class on preaching. I haven't been exposed to Bible teaching, preaching. What in the world am I going to do? And so here's what I did. And my message that morning had 3 parts to it. I'm not going to say it had 3 points to it. It had 3 parts to it. And here are the 3 parts. The first part was the organization that sponsored the concert that I became a Christian at, they had these little pamphlets they would hand out. You know what they are, that we call them tracts. They had these little tracts that they would hand out, and I'd grabbed a few of those tracts. And I mean, I'd started reading in the New Testament. Probably they told me to start reading in John because I'd been reading in John. And I had a bunch of these tracts that had little verses on the back on how to get saved. So I just wrote down all those verses. I had a bunch of those tracts. Every verse on the back of those tracts, I wrote them down. And so the first part of my sermon was just saying all those scriptures. And I had gotten in my Bible reading to John chapter 9 at least, and so I love this story. And so John chapter 9, what we're going to talk about today, was the text of my very first sermon. And this guy that we're going to meet in John chapter 9, basically what he says is, I can't answer all your questions, but I know one thing. Once I was blind, and now I see. And that was the second part of my message. I can't answer any of your questions. I don't know too much about this. I don't know any theology. The only Bible verses I know I just gave you off of the back of these little pamphlets. But once I was blind, but now I see. And then the third part of my sermon was I just told him how I met Jesus. And that was the very first sermon I thought I ever gave. Once I was blind, but now I see. I heard a statement years ago. I love this statement. It is so true. A man simply said this: anyone who has had an experience is never at the mercy of someone with an argument. And there are many that would argue that Jesus isn't alive. They would argue that the born-again experience is just some psychological thing. They would argue away Bible Christianity. But let me tell you this, if you've had an experience, you will never be at the mercy of someone that all they have is an argument. Or all they have is a theology, or all they have is a life perspective or a doctrine. No, we need to be people not only of truth, but we need to be people of an experience. That like this man, he could stand before those who didn't even believe and say, I can't answer all your questions. I'm not even sure who he is, but I know this. Once I was blind, but now I see. Spiritually, can you say that? You know what? All you need is your testimony to be able to impact the world. I'm not saying you shouldn't study and continue in the Bible, but don't feel like because you don't have some great theological education that God can't use you. You have a story. You have the story of what God has done in you, and nobody can take that away from you. And you can say exactly what this man said. Once I was blind, but now I see. Once I was lost, but now I'm found. Once I didn't have peace, but now I do. And it's all because of Jesus Christ. And so we have a lot in common with this man. Well, before we look at the miracle, I want to set up the context of the miracle because I find this to be absolutely fascinating. In chapter 8, Jesus has been talking to, and in a sense, he's been answering the religious leaders, and he has just made a statement. In chapter 8, verse 58, he said to these people, "Most assuredly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." And they wanted to stone him. Look at verse 59, chapter 8. Then they took up stones to throw at him. They had the stones in their hand, and their intent was to stone him. But Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. Now, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was born blind. This is amazing to me. What's going on? Jesus is slipping away. He is escaping those who want to stone him, and while he is slipping away for his life, he sees this man who was born blind, and he stops and he ministers healing to this man. This is incredible. This wasn't like a church service where at the end of the service, he just let the man walk forward and prayed for him. This wasn't like at the end of one of his teachings when everybody was marveling at what he had to say, that he just called this man forward. No, he's escaping for his life. People just a few feet away from him want to stone him. And yet he still stops and takes time to minister to this man that probably nobody else really cared about. At least the religious leaders certainly didn't care about him. We'll see that is obvious in a few moments. I find that to be incredibly revealing about the heart of Jesus. And that tells me something else. Don't you ever think that God is too busy for you. Don't you ever think that God is too preoccupied with all of the major issues of the world to take time for what you have need of. Here we see an example of Jesus trying to escape for his life, and he still stops and ministers to this man. That's incredible. Now, I got to be honest with you, if that was me, I would have kept on going. My mind would have been, hey, this guy's been blind his whole life. A few more days isn't going to matter. I'm out of here. These guys want to stone me. I'm not going to stop and talk to this guy. I'm out of here. How many of you would be like that too? If they're going to stone you, you get out of there. Now, there were other times where people wanted to kill Jesus, and he kind of just, I don't even know how he did it. He kind of just blended into the crowd and just kind of walked around and was gone. I mentioned my first sermon, as bad as it probably was. I mean, I think God used it, but I butchered a lot of things in that first sermon. But I got to be honest with you, my first sermon, probably from one perspective, went a lot better than Jesus' first sermon. You know what their reaction to his first sermon was? In Luke chapter 4, he went into the synagogue and read from Isaiah 61 and said, this has been fulfilled in your hearing of your ears. And then he talked about Naaman, and he talked about the widow of Zarephath. And when he was done preaching, they took him by force out to the edge of the city and were going to throw him over a cliff. Now, they might not have liked my first message. And I was longer-winded than they were used to, even back then. But the worst that happened was they couldn't beat the Lutherans to our favorite restaurant that day. Nobody tried to grab me and throw me off a cliff for what I had to say. But in Luke chapter 4, this is amazing. They grabbed Jesus and they took him by force to throw him off a cliff, and somehow he just kind of walked right away from them. And we see it in John chapter 10. They want to stone him, but somehow he gets away. They want to kill him, rather. And he just kind of walks away from them. And here again, they have the stones in their hands. They want to stone him, and he just kind of walks around them. But rather than being concerned for himself, he pauses to minister to this blind man. And you know what's going to happen. You know he's going to heal the guy. We'll talk about the details of that in a few moments. Matthew Henry put it this way: we make more haste than good speed when we outrun opportunities of doing good. Sometimes we're in such a hurry to get our agenda done. We're in such a hurry maybe for our own needs to be taken care of. We outrun all kinds of needs that are always around us. Jesus didn't. Jesus, while escaping for his life from people that, why was that? He couldn't be stoned. He had to go to the cross. It was important that he died on a cross, not by stoning. And it was much too early in his ministry for that to happen. So he had to escape. But he paused. He stopped. He ministered to this man. And a tremendous miracle. Here's something else that I found amazing. This man himself, later on in our story, this man himself is going to say an amazing thing. The man who's healed himself says, since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone has opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If you read the whole Old Testament, you will find many miracles just like the same types of miracles we've been studying in the Old Testament. There are miracles of abundance. We studied that. Miracles of abundance. He gave manna in the wilderness. He gave water from the rock. Miracles of abundance. The windows of heaven were opened with divine supply. He gave miracles over nature in the Old Testament. The Red Sea parting, an axe head floating, the sun standing still, a rock giving water, miracles over nature. There were miracles of multiplication, oil that multiplied, loaves that multiplied. There were miracles of cleansing in the Old Testament. Naaman, the leper, was cleansed. There were miracles of healing in the Old Testament. Hezekiah was about to die, and God supernaturally healed him. And even in the Old Testament, those who had died were raised from the dead, even in the Old Testament. But nowhere ever has it been recorded that someone who was born blind had their eyes opened. This is the first time a miracle of this nature has ever happened in biblical history. That to me is amazing. And in the future age of the Messiah, it was prophesied, Isaiah 35, that the eyes of the blind will be opened. And when Jesus quoted Isaiah 61 in his first sermon, he quoted, Luke quotes him as saying, and to give sight to the blind. They viewed the coming age of Messiah as a supernatural, miraculous age off into the future where blind eyes would be opened. But they had never witnessed anything like that ever before in their history. There had been the dead had been raised, lepers had been cleansed, those who were dying had been healed, but never had anyone who was born blind been given back given their sight. Never before. When John the Baptist was wondering in prison, are you the one? Are you the Messiah? What was one of the answers of Jesus? The blind are receiving their sight. And many times in the gospel, you see Jesus come along and he heals blind people. Sometimes there's a whole mass, a whole crowd of people, and Jesus heals blind people in that crowd. Other times there are blind men along the road crying out for mercy. Jesus heals them. One of the incredible things about the earthly ministry of Jesus was that he healed blind people. But this is even more. Well, at the end of the message, you'll see it. This is even more. He healed someone who was born blind. It was more than just the eyes. He healed someone who was born blind. Their mind had never created an image in response to what the eye was sending. They were born blind. Never before had this happened. But Jesus does it. Well, let's read about it. Luke chapter 9. We'll pick up pieces of the story as we go. But let's read the first 7 verses. John chapter 9. Now, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, neither man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said these things, he spat on the ground, and he made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And he said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which is translated sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Oh, I love the rhythm of that. He went and he washed and he came back seeing. And later on, he's going to give that same report to others. "I washed and I saw. Now I can see. I went and I washed and now I see." And this man had never seen before. He was born blind. Now I want to look at this miracle from at least 3 different perspectives, and then we'll close by answering the question, what is the message of the miracle? There'll be a 4th point at the end. But here's number 1, the problem of pain. Now this is a theological phrase, the problem of pain. Or it has also been stated the problem of suffering or the problem of evil. But the question is, why is there pain in the world? Why is there suffering in the world? Why is there evil in the world? Why are there people born blind? And the disciples had been hearing and undoubtedly had been exposed to some teaching that was erroneous. But they assumed that if there was a blindness, a congenital blindness, that it must be attributed to someone's sin. And so they said, who sinned, this man or his parents? But the assumption is somebody had to sin or this wouldn't have happened. Now, in terms of his covenant, there are scriptures about visiting the iniquities upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generation. I think that's in a little different context. But read Ezekiel chapter 18, where God says, no longer will this saying be that the fathers did something, so it's now on the children. No longer will the children be judged for the sins of the fathers. No longer will the fathers' sins be judged upon the children, or the children's sins upon the fathers. And Jesus said, neither one. It wasn't these parents that sinned. But notice he also, it wasn't the man that sinned. Now, I know today there's consequences of using drugs, for example, when you're pregnant, and we have babies born addicted to things. I understand that perspective. But their question was going deeper than this. This person is blind because either he sinned or his parents sinned. Now, wait a minute, back up for a minute. If he was born blind, when did he have time to sin if he was born blind? Well, there were some very erroneous beliefs in those days. Dodds gives at least 4 different existing beliefs in that time. Some Jews of that time believed in the pre-existence of souls and the possibility that those pre-existent souls could sin. Nothing in the Bible about that, but some believed that. Some of the Jews at that time believed in some kind of reincarnation, and perhaps the man had sinned in a previous existence. Is that why they said, who sinned? This man? Did he sin? There were those that believed, this to me is absolutely ridiculous. I'm going to take a vote on this one. Some believed that the baby sinned in the mother's womb. How many of you believe that's even possible? What could the baby, well, I don't even know of anything a baby could do in a womb that's sinful. Who did he lie to? But somehow he sinned in his mother's womb. Ridiculous. And then this one, boy, we all would have had it if this one was true. Some thought that the blindness was a punishment that God knew he would commit in the future. That's like a policeman pulling you over and saying, I'm giving you a speeding ticket. And you say, well, no, officer, I was going five miles below the limit. And the officer says, yeah, I know, but I know that in the next 20 years you're going to speed. So here's your ticket. He said, that's ridiculous. That would never. So how could this man have been responsible for being born blind? Yet many people believe he was because of erroneous beliefs. And I believe there are some erroneous beliefs even in our day today. And I think if we take some of our teachings to an extreme, they can become actually hurtful. I remember an occasion where a young man, a promising young man who wanted to serve God, was tragically killed in an accident. And he was from a church that taught a lot about faith and confession. And someone told his parents, well, he died because he didn't have a good confession that morning. He was killed in that accident because he didn't have a good confession. He was killed in that accident because he wasn't in the Word first thing in the morning. And so that's why he was killed. That's what they were telling. That's what they were saying. And I went to the funeral, and these are God-loving, sincere people I'm talking about. I'm not talking about evil people. I'm talking about good people, God-loving people. But a man stood up in that funeral and said, "This is a victory for Satan." And I sat there thinking, where in all of this is the comfort for these grieving parents and family? See, this erroneous teaching that somehow if there's any kind of suffering, if there's any kind of pain, there must be an individual sin behind whatever pain or suffering. And I want to tell you flat out, that just isn't so. Now, I understand there are consequences to sin, but please do not be one of those Christians that if somebody is sick, you come along and in some kind of piety and say, well, you must not have enough faith. If you had faith, you would be healed. If you had the right confession, you would be healed. We can actually become condemning that way. And these guys maybe had a little of that flavor. Who sinned? His parents or him? And Jesus said, neither. No one. No one. And Jesus, here's the answer of Jesus. I love this answer. He said, this is so that the works of God can be revealed. What is he saying? He's basically saying, I'm going to use this. I'm going to use it. I love what one author said. He said, we must stop asking why. The question is not, why are we suffering? The real question is, what are we going to do with it? The real question is not, why do I suffer? The question is, how will I handle my suffering? What will I do with my suffering? Will I take my suffering to God and say, God, use this. Somehow, work your glory in this. Somehow, work your works in this. Jesus said, it's not this man's sin. It's not his parents' sin. It happened so that the work of God can be revealed. Remember John chapter 11 when his good friend Lazarus died? And Jesus said, this sickness is not unto death, but this sickness is unto the glory of God. Basically what he was saying was, I'm going to use this. Stop getting hung up on the whys. You're never going to understand all that stuff. Give it up. We're not that smart. Just give it up and say, God, I'm not going to focus on the why is this suffering happening. I'm going to focus on what I'm going to do with it. What am I going to do with it? Am I going to let you use it, Lord? Am I going to submit it to you? Jesus said this happened so that the work of God could be put on display. Here's the bottom line. We live in a fallen creation. Why is there pain in the world? Why is there suffering in the world? Why is there evil in the world? Because we are a part of a fallen creation. The Bible says in Romans 5 that death has come upon all men, even on those who did not sin in the same manner that Adam sinned. Death has come upon all of us now. You see, it is not an individual right now in the contemporary time sin that causes all this. It's all the ongoing effects of Adam's sin. When Adam sinned, the whole creation was thrown down. When Adam sinned, there was introduced into the human experience something that wasn't there before. Death. God told him, the day you eat of that fruit, dying you shall die. And they ate of it, and the process of death began, and sickness and pain and suffering are all a part of that death that was introduced into the human experience through the sin, not of every individual, but the sin of Adam. Why do people get sick? Why are there deformities? Why are there physical things to overcome? Because we live in a fallen creation. This world is not what God created it to be. Romans chapter 8 actually says all of creation itself is groaning, waiting, yearning, longing to be set free. It's under some kind of bondage because of Adam's sin. In our experience today, as it has been since the time of Adam, even the very best of people can suffer bad things. And it is not because they are wicked people. It is not because they do not have faith. It's because they are part of a human race that lives in a fallen creation. But I've got good news. Jesus has come into that creation. He is God in the flesh, and He has paid the price to redeem you and I, our bodies, our souls, our minds, all of creation, and someday He will return, and He will exert all of His authority, and this whole creation will be liberated. Won't that be a great day? But right now, we live as a part of a fallen creation, and we're reaching out to God by faith, and our emphasis should not be on why is there this suffering, but our emphasis should be, what am I going to do with it? Am I going to allow this suffering to turn me into some kind of a victim? Am I going to live my whole life with the woe is me? Or I'm going to say, God, I am giving this suffering to you. I'm submitting this to you, that you would do something in it, that you would do something with it. We all affirm those great words of Romans chapter 8 that say all things work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. God can use all things. Jesus basically said, it is not that this man has sinned, it is not that his parents have sinned, but I'm going to use this. So what situation are you in today? What suffering is there? What hardship is there in your life? What pressure are you under? Stop worrying about, well, is this because of my sin or somebody? No, just say, God, here's the suffering. I pray that you will work in it, that you will somehow bring your redemptive power to bear on my situation. Bring your grace into my weakness. Bring your grace into my infirmity. But more than anything else, Lord, be glorified. Be glorified. And there are times when God will be glorified by doing something, as He does here, supernatural. But we are to submit it to Him as a part of a fallen creation. There is what is called a principle of design, where God knew you in your mother's womb, and God was fashioning you in your mother's womb. God was shaping you, and it was all a part of His design to make you into what He wants you to be. God uses pain. And you will never become like Christ without pain. So it is not a matter of where does the suffering come from or why is there pain. It is a question of what you will do with it, of how you will respond, if you will submit to God even in the midst of it. Jesus said it wasn't this man's sin, it wasn't his parents' sin, it was so that the works of God could be revealed. I'm going to do something. So right now in your situation, before we go any farther, why don't you just whisper those words, Lord, do something in my situation. I'm just asking you to do something, Lord. I'm not going to dictate to you what it should be. I'm just asking you to do something, Lord. Because you're the Redeemer of this fallen creation. And my faith is in you. Notice the priority of Jesus. He said in verses 4 and 5, I must work the works of Him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world. Oh, how He would say such a thing when He's about to heal a blind man, a man who's never experienced light. And there He paused, verse 6. When He had said these things, He spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva, and He anointed the eyes of the blind man with clay. And here Jesus, when He should have been escaping, when He should have been more mindful of His own safety, He stopped. And He did something to set this man free from his blindness. The problem of pain, what is the answer? I know it might not suffice to many of our minds, but it's simply we're a part of a fallen creation. But the challenge is to submit it to God. The challenge is to allow God to use it, to do something of His work, of His power, of His nature, of His love, of His grace, of His glory in the midst of our pain. It's happened so that the works of God could be revealed. Number 2, let's look at what we're calling the power of God. We saw the problem of pain was number 1. Number 2 is the power of God, and that is the miracle itself. The miracle itself. Jesus Christ never gave us a handbook on the formulas for miracles. As you look at all the different miracles that Jesus did, many of them are so different. They're many faceted as how He did the miracles. Sometimes He just says, okay, they're healed. You have what you believe for, and it happens. Other times he lays hands on. Oftentimes he tells people to go do something. But here, this one's strange. He uses his spit. He uses his spit to bring about a healing. Twice in the Gospel of Mark, he used his spit. One time he spit and touched the guy's tongue, and the guy could talk normal. Another time he spit right on the blind guy's eyes, and he could see again. You see, if there was a set pattern, we would turn it into incantations and formulas. We would work it like magic. No, doing of miracles is not based on a formula. Doing of a miracle is not based on some magic words that you say. Being part of a miracle is all dependent on being sensitive to the Spirit of God, of sensing what the Spirit of God. Jesus said, I only do those things I see my Father doing. And there were times when Jesus would say, get up, take up that bed and walk. There are other times he'd use his spit. One time he stuck his fingers in a guy's ears. Now look, if you're going to go around spitting on people and sticking your finger in their ears, you better be led by the Spirit of God. You better get a miracle out of that, or you're going to need a miracle. So Jesus did some very unusual things. Why? Because he didn't want it to be a formula. He didn't want it to be a religious ritual. He wanted his people to depend upon the Holy Spirit just like he did, and he wanted his people to be able to sense the urging and the nudging and the leading of the Holy Spirit just like he did. He wants it to be done in relationship with him. Not some incantation we simply repeat. So sometimes he spits. Sometimes he just speaks. But it's interesting. Why? Somebody said, I know they weren't thinking. Somebody said, why did he put mud on the guy's eyes? It would have made it harder for him to see. He's already blind. He can't see anyway. So yeah. But ask yourself, why did he tell this guy to go to this pool, which was a little ways away? Why did he tell this guy, you go over to that pool now and wash this off? Jesus is slipping away from those who want to stone him, and yet he stops and he spits on the ground and he makes a little pack of mud or goo or something from the ground with his spit, and he just pats it on the guy's eyes and says, go wash. Now the guy had never met Jesus before. The guy was just standing there. But he goes and washes. I love that, to get the rhythm of it again. I went and I washed and I came back seeing. Why did Jesus do that? I mean, did this guy have to have his friends help him find that pool of Siloam? I mean, he's blind. Now, maybe he knew how to make his way there. I don't know, but here's a blind guy. Why did Jesus tell him to go do that? Well, I think there's two reasons. One's very practical, and one maybe we can apply to us. Oftentimes, we need to understand faith must have an expression. And so many times Jesus told people to do something. Pick up your bed and walk. And what he meant was that mat that people carried him around on. Well, if he's going to be healed, he'll never need that mat again. But Jesus said, pick it up. Stretch out your hand. Go show yourself to the priests. Even at the very first miracle, turning water into wine, whatever Jesus says to do it. Oftentimes he gave people something to do as an expression of their faith. Faith without works is dead. So maybe there's something he's telling you to do in your situation. Just do it. And so faith needs an expression. But I think this is so, I want to say cool, but maybe that's not the right word to say. But I think it's so cool why Jesus might have done this. He puts this clay on this guy's eyes and says, you go to the pool and wash it, because he knows that when that miracle occurs, where's all the attention of the crowd? Where's their attention going to be? Their attention is going to be on that man and anybody standing with him. And Jesus is trying to slip away. Jesus is trying to get away. Jesus is trying to stay incognito and get away from those who want to stone him. So he puts mud on the guy's eyes and says, you go over there and wash. And when the miracle happens over there, do you think the guy was quiet? It doesn't say, but I bet he started, I see. He'd never seen before. I bet you there was a little bit of a commotion, and everybody turned their heads and looked in that direction, and Jesus was long gone. The wisdom of Jesus. The grace, the mercy, the love, yet the wisdom of Jesus. And Jesus healed many blind eyes. The real key question now comes in number 3. We see the problem of pain, and we see the power of God in doing this great miracle. He spit, he made the clay, He anointed the guy's eyes. He told him to go wash. The guy went. He washed. He was healed. But here's the big question. The big question is the person of Jesus. Who is he? Now, the rest of this chapter is all about who is this? Who did this? And so I want to introduce you to some people in the rest of the chapter. Right after this guy comes back in verse 7, so he went and washed and came back seeing. Therefore the neighbors and those who had previously seen that he was blind said, is not this he who sat and begged? Some said, this is he. Others said, no, it's like him. And then he said, no, I am he. I am that guy. Notice it says neighbors. Now in those days, people didn't have babies at hospitals because they didn't have hospitals. You had your baby in your house. Maybe you had a midwife come and help, but your neighbors came and helped. And it was a celebration. When somebody had a baby in the neighborhood, it was a celebration. And the women from the neighborhood would come and help. And immediately these same neighbors would have come into this woman's home and they would have shared in the tragedy. Oh, wait a minute, your child can't see. It's obvious your child isn't responding. Your child can't see. And that news would have spread throughout the neighborhood. They had a child born blind. Their child is blind. And so these neighbors watched this guy grow up. They watched him grow up. They saw how he every day would go to the same spot and beg. That's all he could do. They knew this guy. And now he can see. And now he's saying, I can see. And someone said, well, is it really him or is it just somebody that looks like him? He says, no, it's me. It's me. So they went and told the Pharisees, hey, this guy was healed. Here's the problem. It was on the Sabbath. Oh, it was on the Sabbath. Look at all the work Jesus did. He made a little thing of clay. He made a little spit and mud. And he healed a guy on the Sabbath. And so the neighbors come and say, we know it's him. And so now the Pharisees come, and here's the second group I want to show you their reaction. Who is Jesus? Now they get the parents. As you read the story on in verses 18 through 22, and at one time you can kind of judge the parents, but you got to see it in context. Once you see it in context, you won't judge them. Because now the Pharisees get to the parents, and they say, is this your son? Was he really born blind? He now sees. Is he your son? How did this happen? And they knew that they had threatened to throw people out of the synagogue if they trusted in Jesus. And so the parents said, well, we know he's our son, and we know he's been born blind. We know he was born blind. Oh, but he's of age. Ask him. In other words, we don't want to get in the middle of this controversy. We don't want to get thrown out of the synagogue. Now, I was in Indonesia several years ago where we baptized some people, and because of the heavy influence of radical Islam that was around us in that area, once these people were baptized, they had a whole system where some of them, if they were from certain areas, they would hide them for up to a year so that they could disciple them and get them grounded in the faith before they had to face persecution. Because upon hearing that a grown child, maybe a college-age child, had come to faith in Christ, people in a certain neighborhood or out in the villages, if they heard of a child converting to Christianity, they would threaten the parents. They would say things like, you will never work in this region again if your child does not come back to Islam. We will burn your house down if you do not make your daughter come back to Islam and marry a Muslim boy. See, parents live with that kind of pressure in different places in the world. And the Bible says the fear of man brings a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord shall be safe. But in the time of Jesus, John 7:13, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews. John 12:42, even among rulers many believed on him, but because of the Pharisees they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. And so these parents find themselves under this intense pressure. And they say, well, we know he's our son, and we know that he was born blind, but how he got healed, you'll have to ask him. He's of age. I don't judge them for that. I know maybe it would be better reading, and we'd feel better about it if they said, yes, it was Jesus of Nazareth, so do to us what you will. Our son is healed. But that wasn't their reaction. They said, he's of age. Just ask him yourself. Ask him yourself. And so the Pharisees start dialoguing with this man. Let's see who the Pharisees think Jesus is. Verse 16, they don't think he's from God. Verse 29, we don't know where he's from. Verse 24, he's a sinner. He did this on the Sabbath, so he can't be of God. He is a sinner. We are Moses' disciples. We follow the law. But this guy, we don't even know where he came from. He must be a sinner. The one thing you don't hear in their voice is any rejoicing for the healing of this guy. What you don't see even an ounce of in their heart is any kind of love or compassion for a man who spent most of his life in darkness. They only care about their interpretation of the law. They only care about their religion. So whoever healed this man, he cannot be of God. He's a sinner. He did it on the Sabbath day. I love this man's response. And he just keeps sticking up for Jesus even though he doesn't know Jesus yet. And they end up throwing him out of the synagogue. Verse 34. They answered and said to him, "You were completely born in sins, and are you teaching us?" And they cast him out. That word cast him out means they excommunicated him, which one author said he would then be treated worse than a leper if you were excommunicated. Notice their arrogancy. You were born in your sin. Why would they say that? Because he was born blind. You are born in your sin, and you're trying to teach us. You're out of here. We excommunicate you. But I want you to see the progression of who this man said Jesus was. And by the way, Jesus told his followers that the day will come when people will throw you out of their synagogues and they'll think they're doing God a favor. In verse 11, when the neighbors ask, who did this? And the man who was healed, he simply said, a man named Jesus. That's all I know. I know he was a man, and I know he was named Jesus. That's all I know. He doesn't know anything else. And then in verse 17, he goes a little further. When he's arguing with the Pharisees, he says, well, he's a prophet. That was pretty clever of him to say, because there were many in that day that believed that if you were a prophet of God, you could dispense with the Sabbath observances. Somehow you were able to get over all those laws and traditions. So he said, well, he's a prophet. And they said, no, now glorify God and say that he's not a prophet. Say that he's a sinner. Come on, say that he's a sinner. And he says in verse 34, then answered and said to him, or verse 32, he said, since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Now the man says he's from God. He starts off by saying he's a man. Then he says he's a prophet. And now he says he's from God. So they throw him out. I love this about Jesus. Pick up this story in verse 35. When Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, Jesus sought him out. Isn't that just like Jesus, to seek that which is lost, to seek the outcast, to seek out the one that others would reject? Jesus seeks him out. And Jesus finds him. And Jesus says, do you believe in the Son of God? And the man answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? The guy basically says this, I want to believe, I just don't know who he is. He wants to believe. But he doesn't know. He doesn't have the information. He doesn't have enough. But he wants to believe. Now get the prophetic nature of this answer. This man, up until this moment, has never seen Jesus. Because when Jesus put that mud on his eyes, when Jesus talked to him before, the guy was still blind. This guy has never seen the face of Jesus. And he says, I want to believe in the Son of God, but who is he? And Jesus says, you have seen him. He said that to a blind guy. You've seen him. And he's here talking to you now. Now, it doesn't say this. It uses the word worship, but I see this in my mind. When Jesus said, you have seen him. And he's here talking to you now. In my mind, I just see this guy dropping to his knees. Because it says he believed on him and he worshiped him. Right in the crowd, he worshiped him. Even though he had been kicked out of the religious institution, he could still worship the true Son of God. He worshiped him. He believed upon him. And it is this believing upon him that it enables us to be what we call saved. John put it this way: these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you have life in his name. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that whosoever believes should not perish but have life everlasting. And here this man, he's blind. He starts by saying, he's a man. And then he says, he's a prophet. And he says, he must be of God. And then he says, you're my Lord. And he worships him. Where are you at? Where are you at in your progression? Where are you at in who is Jesus? Who do you believe he is? Isn't that the question Jesus asked his disciples? Who do you say that I am? Flesh and blood is not what reveals it. It's a revelation of the Father. And I love this guy's answer to the Pharisees in verse 25. He answered and said, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. Later on he says he's not a sinner, but at that point he said, I don't know. I can't answer your questions, but I know one thing. I once was blind, now I see. A man with an experience is never at the mercy of a man with an argument, or a man with a theology, or a man with a religion, or a man with a philosophy. And you will never be at the mercy of someone who wants to argue with you. You just stick with Jesus. Just talk about Jesus. You don't need to answer all the questions of the universe. Just tell them what Jesus did in your universe. Tell them what Jesus did in you. Tell them how you were bound, but now you're free. How you were lost, now you're found. How you were confused, now you have peace. How you were in turmoil, now you have love. Tell them about Jesus. And you'll never be at their mercy. They might have all the theology, they might have all the philosophy, they might have all the education, but you'll never be at their mercy. You can simply say, once I was blind, but now I see. There was a seminary that once hosted what was called Baptist Day. And on Baptist Day, they invited all the Baptist preachers from the entire region and state, as many as could get there, for a free day at their campus. And they would bring in a noted theologian or some big name in the field of theology, some highly educated guy. And they told the Baptist pastors this year, bring your own lunch, and we'll have a picnic area, and we'll have a lecture all morning, and then you can have your lunch, and then we'll have this guest speaker all afternoon, and he'll lecture, and it'll all be for free. They're doing it to promote the college. And so in this particular year, they brought in a theologian, Dr. Paul Tillich, and Dr. Paul Tillich, for 2.5 hours, he was set about proving that the resurrection of Jesus was false. Using all these intellectual, philosophical arguments that there was no such thing as the resurrection, there was nothing supernatural, and all of these claims of Christianity were false. And nobody would argue with him because, after all, he's the intellect, he's the brain, he's the one that's the theologian. And at the end of his lecture, he opened it up for questions, but nobody dared ask him a question. Until one Baptist preacher that was dressed more like a farmer, and I love farmers, that's my heritage, my grandpa, but this guy was there dressed more like a farmer than a suit of a preacher. He stands up, and he still had his paper bag from his lunch with him. He had that paper bag in his hand, and he said, he had a little accent, he held his hand, he said, Dr. Tillich, I have a question, Dr. Tillich. And, oh, yes, what is your question? And the guy just stood there, and he unrolled the top of his sack, and he reached in and he pulled out an apple. He'd had it left over from his lunch, and everybody's looking at him like, who is this oddball? What is he doing? And he pulls this apple out, and right as everybody's waiting for his question, he takes a big crunching bite out of the apple. And he just stands there chewing it for a few moments. And everybody's looking at him, and he's chewing his apple, and it's a nice juicy apple, so he wipes it off his mouth. And then finally, Dr. Tillich said, well, what is your question? And he says, well, Dr. Tillich, and he held up the apple with a bite mark out of it. He said, this here apple, is it sweet or is it bitter? And everybody kind of, what is this? And Dr. Tillich didn't know how to answer. And finally said, well, I can't answer that question because I've never tasted your apple. And as the guy rolled up his paper sack, he said, Dr. Tillich, and neither have you tasted my Jesus. And at that, the 1,000 audience of a Baptist preacher began to applaud. Because here was a man, and he had no theological argument to the great mind of Dr. Tillich, but he had an experience. Like this man who had no argument with the Pharisees that he could win, but he had an experience. Once I was blind, but now I see. And so I ask you, where are you in this whole process? Where are you in terms of once you were blind, but do you now see? Let's close by looking at the miracle, the message in the miracle. Number 4, the message in the miracle. Real quickly, what is it? Well, we're all blind. The Bible concludes that every single man or woman born is spiritually blind. We're like groping along the wall. We're walking like blind men. We don't know where we're going. The way of the wicked is as darkness. Isaiah said we're like people groping along the wall because we're blind. We love it when Jesus rebukes the Pharisees and calls them the blind leading the blind. We say, yeah, see there, he called the Pharisees blind. But who were they leading? All the common people were blind too. We're all blind. Isaiah said the people who sit in darkness, Isaiah 9, they will see a great light. So we're all blind. Our foolish hearts are darkened, Romans 1:21. Our understanding is darkened, being alienated from the life that is in God, Ephesians 4:18. If our gospel is hid, it's hidden from those whom the God of this world has blinded, 2 Corinthians 4:4. We're all blind. What did Jesus say in verse 5 of our text? I'm the light of the world. I am the light. Letter B, Jesus came to be the light. He is the light of the world. This is the life. In him was life, and this life was the light of all men. And he lights the way of all men. And whoever comes to him is never going to live in darkness. Jesus, we are all blind, but Jesus is the light. But you know, if you're blind, the light still does you no good. The warmth of the sun can be felt upon the skin, but light itself does no good to a blind person. And so letter C, Jesus not only came to be the light, Jesus came to give sight. To give sight to the blind. And this is an amazing miracle. Let me read you a bit of a quote here. In his brilliant new book, Catching the Light, quantum physicist. Now, right there, you don't need to know anymore, but what this guy's really smart, right? Anytime you see the word quantum and then it's followed by physicist, you know this is a guy that's way beyond me. And I have a feeling he's beyond you too. But anyway, Catching the Light, quantum physicist Arthur Sajak writes of what he describes as the intertwined history of light and mind. And here's what his study was. He was studying what is necessary for there to be sight. And he was studying both animals and humans and what goes on in that critical window of development in their brain, where there's a certain period of time early in their life where sensory and motor skills are formed. And if they're not formed in these early ages, it's like playing catch-up, if not impossible, the rest of their life. And here's what he found. You could take a transplant and transplant a cornea into someone who had seen. And you plant that cornea in them and they can see again. But if you take that same healthy eye or that cornea and you transplant it into someone who's never seen, they don't see normal. They don't see like you thought they would see. Why? It's very simple. The sight is more than just an eye functioning. There's got to be something developed in the brain that can create that visual image that we call, the perception that we call the sensation of sight. And he calls that the inner light. He says about one young boy, they put cornea in him, and he'd never seen. He was born blind, congenital blindness. And upon waking up after surgery, he says, and I quote, "The world does not appear to the patient as filled with gifts of intelligible light and color and shape upon awakening from surgery." He goes on to say this, "The light of day beckoned, but no light of the mind replied in the boy. The power of employment of this power, which is to give light, is a whole. There's something more to the act of seeing." He goes on to say this, "The sober truth remains that vision requires far more than a functioning physical organ. Without an inner light, without formative visual imagination, we are blind. That the inner light, the light of the mind, must flow into and marry with the light of nature to bring forth a seeing world, or to bring forth a world." What is he saying? You can have a healthy eye, you can have a healthy optic nerve, but if the things in the brain haven't developed, you still don't see. There's got to be something on the inside. Now let's make a spiritual analogy of what Jesus does. Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. But people still don't believe in Him. They don't believe in Him until somehow there's something on the inside that comes alive. Somehow the light must shine inside of them so that they can behold the beauty of Jesus. Last week I quoted John Piper. Let me quote him again. He said, the root of our problem of being lost is not that we have a bent against God. And that's a theological term that we're all born with a sinful nature, a bent against God. He said the real root of the issue is not that we are bent against God. The root of the issue is we are blinded to God. And the very root of our salvation is not our decision that Jesus is true. It is what he calls the spiritual gift of sight. That at one moment we saw Jesus for who He is. That we saw the beauty of Jesus. That as it says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, God caused the light to shine in our hearts that we would behold the glory of God in the face of Jesus. Something has to happen on the inside of you or you'll never see. The light can be right in front of you and you will never see unless there's a miracle within inside of you. And that miracle is what we call conversion. That miracle is where the Spirit of God unveils those eyes of your heart and you know that Jesus is God. And you know that He's the Son of God. And you know that He is alive. And you might not know any Bible verses. And you might not have a theological argument. But something has happened inside of you. And you know that Jesus is real. Like this blind man, you can say, once I was blind, but now I see. And you can throw me out of your synagogues, and you can cast me out of your temples, and you can treat me like a leper, but I have an experience. I believe upon the Son of God. I have seen Him, and I believe in Him. And I worship Him. Do you know how you know who has truly encountered Jesus? They worship Him. For they have seen Him. Not with these physical eyes, but something much deeper, much more profound. They can pull out your eyeballs and you'll still believe because you see in your heart. Once I was blind, but now I see. I close by suggesting that you are just like this blind guy. You are standing there in your lostness, but Jesus has come your way. Jesus sees you when you couldn't see Him. Jesus has a love for you when you didn't have a love for Him. Jesus' heart goes out toward you when your heart could not go out toward Him. And He seeks you out. And this very moment, He stands before you. And He asks you, do you believe in the Son of God? And if you say, who is He? I want to believe. He would say, I'm right here in front of you. Here I am. And His Spirit will lift the veil off of your eyes. Just like that man washed the mud off of his blind eyes and he could see, the Spirit of God will wash the veil off of your heart and you will see and you will know. And not even hell itself can take it away from you. For you have seen Him and He stands ever before you. Let's rise together. Shall we stand together? And musicians, will you come? And we're going to conclude with a song of worship, just turning our hearts to the Lord in praise. And if you're here today and you've never met Jesus, you've never had this miracle of sight, this inner sight where your heart comes alive, where your spirit comes alive, and you see what you never saw before about Jesus, where you know that Jesus is alive and He's real and He loves you, and you know Him, Right now, just open up to him and say, God, I'm like that blind man. I want to know you. I want to believe. So Jesus, reveal yourself to me. Jesus, come into my life. Jesus, come into my heart. And he will. And you too will become a man or a woman with an experience. Once you were blind, but now you see. Because Jesus Christ is alive and he's real. And he wants to give you not only eyes, he wants to give you sight. So let's worship him. And as we're worshiping him, if you'd like to come and pray about anything, come and pray. If you've never received Jesus as your Lord and Savior, do two things. Pray. Ask him into your heart. Say, Lord, I want to believe. I want to know you. I want that, Lord. I'm like that guy in the Bible. I want it. Jesus, come into my life. Pray that. You pray that. And then what I'd like you to do is afterwards, you come up to one of us and tell us you prayed that. You take a step. You come tell us you prayed that. We'll help you on your journey. It's a journey. Let's worship him.